First of all, I'd like to thank the gallery for inviting me here. It's my first time in Moritz, the first time in this gallery. And this is a very special show. The metal works have been seen quite a lot in New York and in the United States generally, not quite so much in Europe. He devised this system in 1983 for the laser cut metal drawings. In fact, the first ones were cut by hand. He'd been working as an artist since 1959. He was 28 when he finished art school. He was actually quite a late starter. And it was only when he went to New York to study at the Cooper Union that he decided to train as a painter instead. He graduated in 1959, and in that very year, he made the first collages, which were to lead a year later to the first of his great American nude paintings, which were paint and collage on canvas. By 1962, he was already an internationally recognized artist. But he had a rather strange relationship with the art world, because although he was always included in all the pop art exhibitions, he didn't have a retrospective of his work in his own country in his lifetime. He died in 2004, just before Christmas, at the age of 73, never having seen a retrospective on his own territory. The first retrospective he had, in fact, was in 1993 in Japan, which I had the privilege of curating. When I first met him in 1988, I was doing research on a book about pop art, and I was touring around the United States to meet the artists that I hadn't spoken to before, and he was clearly one of the major exponents with Warhol and Lichtenstein, Oldenburg and Rosenquist in Indiana of American pop art. It wasn't a term that he liked himself. He preferred to be called a new realist, which was from the French term, of course, the Nouveau Realiste movement. But he was a reluctant member of the movement, nevertheless a very important one. And when my pop art book came out in 1990, the work on the cover was in fact one of Tom's. During the 1960s and 70s, there were lots of new developments in his work all the time. He decided to work with very traditional subject matter, the female nude, still lives, and landscapes, but to do them in a very innovative way, not only making reference to commercial popular culture, but also using new procedures, new techniques that were first devised for the commercial sphere. So here on the wall behind you, there's some vacuum-formed plastic works from the mid-60s, and he always looked with interest at billboards and signs and the kind of information that was used by industry to sell products, and he decided he would use those procedures in order to make his art. This was a very subversive thing to do in a way, because they were not traditional fine art techniques. And he started thinking about ways of making paintings that had the freshness and immediacy and vitality of his drawings. He was always drawing. He was drawing nudes from life, as a very traditional artist might do. And he wanted to preserve that sense of spontaneity and immediacy in the work. And he hit on the idea of replicating the drawing in metal. And the first works that were done in that way, in 1983, were cut out by fabricators from reproductions of the drawings. But he then, with computer technology and specialist fabricators, eventually arrived at a way of making these works using laser technology. So they're cut very precisely from the drawing. And he talks about his excitement in making these first works, that he could lift off the wall and he could hold the drawing in his hand as an object. When he was a young man, his favorite artist was Willem de Kooning, a Dutch-born abstract expressionist. And like a lot of artists of his generation, of the pop art generation, he looked to the abstract expressionists as the artist that he most admired, but that he needed to supersede, the situation of killing the father, as they call it. So he had to find his own way of doing it, but he wanted to preserve a lot of what he loved about abstract expressionism, which was the large scale, the boldness, the immediacy of impact, the physicality of the paints. So it was a very long journey to come to make these works. And what he would do is, in the studio, he would pose the model. He would draw with very thick black marker pens on shiny paper, and these were then photographed and scanned, and they served as the basis for the digital information which went into the laser cutting. This was long before all of us caught up with computer technology in our everyday lives. So he was very secretive when he started making these, because he was afraid that other artists would learn about the technique he was using and would start making work in the same process. In fact, nobody else has really done anything like this, even now, and he died 11 years ago. These large works are all made as unique pieces. They're all painted by hand. In some cases, you'll see like the Monica with Matisse and Pillow on that wall. It's painted in black, like the original drawing. So that, for him, was like a big drawing on the wall. If he painted them in color, he thought of it more as a painting. And interestingly, here we have on that wall a work in black of Monica on a blanket, of which there's another version in color in the back room, and it's really worth looking very closely and comparing them and seeing how much changes with the addition of color. They look as though they're almost like printed color, but in fact, they're very carefully painted by hand, and there are even gradations of color sometimes, as here. So they're much more subtle than their linear look might suggest. There are references in these paintings to the work of other artists like Matisse, as I said there. Here, his studio assistant Monica with a Mondrian painting. His dealer for many years in New York was Sidney Janis, who was one of the dealers who showed Mondrian early on in the United States. So there was a very personal connection for him there. There are often references to the work of other artists. The most recent work is 15 years old, and to me, they still look like very new works. They look like works by a young artist. You could imagine that a very confident 25 or 30-year-old artist could make images like these, and yet he had the experience of a lifetime by the time he made these, and kept his youthful vigor and his excitement about making art. So I think the only other thing I would draw your attention to is the lit cigarette here from 1980, which is one of his rare sculptures. A lot of the work is sculptural in feeling and has a three-dimensionality. These are really reliefs as much as they are paintings. But only occasionally did he move completely into 3 dimensions, and that's the case with this smoking cigarette. In the late 60s, he'd made a series of paintings called Smokers, which were of female lips with very bright red lipstick and the cigarette smoke coming out of their mouths. And this relates to that imagery in his work. I think he didn't make much sculpture because he was very friendly with the other New York pop artists and very aware that Oldenburg and Indiana and Lichtenstein all made sculpture, so perhaps he shied away from it because he didn't want to enter an already slightly crowded field. But when he did do it, he did it again in his own voice. And the simplification that you see in that sculpture is very much like the economy that you see in these steel drawings. People see things that look very simple, and they're in fact among the most difficult things to make. One of his great artist heroes was Matisse, and what he loved in Matisse was was the precision of that line and how much could be communicated by the line. And in order to make these works, the line has to be continuous. To be cut out of metal, it can't be interrupted because otherwise that part would have fallen out. So there's a lot of mental agility that went into making these. But he didn't want the viewer to feel the weight of his efforts. He wanted them to look effortless and joyful, and to communicate that to the viewer, to communicate the experience he had in looking and in making the work to us in turn. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.